All right. We're in Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Our plan is for this morning to actually finish Ecclesiastes. At the conclusion of this class, of the Ecclesiastes class, you may have noticed as you walked in on the table in the foyer, in addition to all the notes from Andrew Jonas, by the way, from the gospel meeting that he preached, all the PowerPoint notes that he gave us, as well as this morning's bulletin and sermon outline, are also two sets of notes. One is for 1 Peter, an introduction to 1 Peter, and then 1 Peter chapter 1 with questions on the back of that. That will be our next study going into after Ecclesiastes, keeping with our desire to study text on Sunday mornings. And then Wednesday night, once we finish with that study of kind of going through the timeline, looking at the origins of the different denominations and so forth, I'm open to any suggestions in terms of topics or subjects. And if nobody has anything in particular, then we will move on into Hebrews or something that everybody wants to study in terms of a text as well on Wednesday nights. But let me know in terms of any subjects or topics that you think would be a good study going forward on Wednesday nights. But starting, like I said, Lord willing, we will finish Ecclesiastes chapter 12. I don't know how long it'll take. We may actually have some time at the end of class to begin our introduction to 1 Peter. But if we don't, we will start 1 Peter next week. All right. So Ecclesiastes chapter 12. We have been discussing Solomon dealing with this aging process that he is informing the youth about. He's specifically addressing young people, and he is encouraging them to understand that life will not always be as it is now in your youth. Use your youth while you have it. Enjoy it. Okay, it's a blessing from God. Make sure you're serving God. He addresses that at the end of chapter 11. And then here in chapter 12, he introduces this idea of remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come. Not that you won't have difficult days when you're young, but specifically the physical and difficulties that come specifically with aging. Okay, where the body starts to deteriorate, the mind isn't as sharp, the memory isn't as quick. This is what he's specifically addressing, having set forth a pattern of behavior and a pattern of thought process of seeking to serve God. That way, when these difficult times do come and it's harder for you to do the things maybe you're used to doing, you fall back on your second nature, so to speak, your pattern of trusting in God and keeping Him first in your life. And even specifically, that you never blame God for what's happening. And that's another aspect to this, is that this is a part of life. This is part of what Solomon has observed throughout Ecclesiastes, is that this is our physical life under the sun. It's not a condemnation from God when you start to age, or when disease comes upon us, or when body parts start breaking down. That's not a condemnation from God. It is simply a part of nature. So don't accuse God or blame God or think God is mad at you. This is a part of life. And so you need to understand that process, especially for when we're really young, before we get up into mid-age, when we start to realize that things don't quite work as well as you age. That youth, that feeling of invincibility, that feeling of energy and strength will not always be there. And so we discussed how that he brings out these analogies, physical analogies, which represents the aging process. He describes the sun and the light of the moon, and the stars grow dark, and the clouds disappear after the rain, being sight, not being able to see as well as somebody used to. Those who keep watch over the house begin to tremble. Those would be the hands. The virile men. Now, so by the way, I wanted to kind of give y'all an example of the New English translation. And this is the New English translation, by the way. So I'll flip over to the New King James here in just a moment, but I wanted to show you kind of a little bit slightly different way of saying things that the New English translation has versus the New King James. The virile men begin to stoop over. Okay, we talked about how the backs begin to kind of hunch over, not quite as strong. The grinders begin to cease because they grow few, talking about teeth. Those who look through the windows grow dim. We talked about the possibility of this also being eyesight. My personal thought process is that this is a little bit more to speaking to that which is behind the eyes, that energy and sparkle of life. And it could, somebody mentioned memory last time, it could be pertaining to that. But specifically looking through windows, seeing everybody else outside and enjoying life, but I'm not able to. So it kind of may speak to this lack of energy, lack of ability to do things. The doors along the street are shut when the sound of the grinding mill grows low. I'm talking about hearing, not being able to hear as well as one once did. And yet, kind of the paradox to this is one is awakened by the sound of a bird, and all their songs grow faint. A little bit different wording than in the New King James. The concept of one is awakened by the sound of a bird, even the smallest little thing, the smallest vibration can wake someone up, and then they're up, and they can't go back to sleep. And for whatever reason, whyever that is, it does seem to get worse with age. And then still with the idea, though, that despite that, the songs, and I think the New King James has something about the daughters of song grow faint, no longer able to hear that, and yet just the smallest little thing will wake one up. Okay, so anything through verse 4. So interestingly enough, with the New King James, some of these, I remember we talked a little bit about the Septuagint and some of the Hebrew manuscripts, and how that in the American Standard and King James, how that some of the Old Testament is slightly different. Like a lot of that, in fact, we talked a lot about how like 90% of the differences between the American Standard and the King James, the manuscripts that they're based upon, are mainly in the Old Testament, whereas maybe 10 to 20% of them are in the New Testament. And a lot of that's because of the different Septuagint and the different manuscripts available for the Old Testament having been translated from Hebrew to Greek versus the original Hebrew. So anyway, anything through verse 4. Verse 5. Also, and this is going back to, I'm transferring back to the New King James for a minute. Also, they are afraid of height and of terrors in the way. When the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper is a burden, and desire fails. For man goes to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. All right. So they are afraid of height and of terrors in the way. What does that mean? Say what now?
They're afraid of heights. Would that be authority, maybe? They're afraid of?
Okay.
Powers to be?
It could be. What else, keeping in line with the theme of what Solomon's dealing with in terms of the physical nature of aging? Sorry? Fear of falling. Okay. So interestingly enough, here in the New English translation, they are afraid of heights and the dangers in the street. The idea that even the most common of things, carrying in groceries, where before when they were young would not have posed much of a danger, now just walking outside on the sidewalk is one has to step very carefully when they're aged. Because if they fall, and we've all known people or have had individuals close to us where they're up in age, they fall, they break a hip or something, and it's very difficult to come to recover from something like that when you're up in age. And it creates a situation where this is why they're afraid of heights. Not even necessarily up high, but just standing up and walking around can be a difficult feat for some. Dangers in the streets, not necessarily people, but just walking in the street. I mean, if you step in a hole and lose your footing, Okay, a lot of times we help our elderly to, a lot of times we just kind of take the ramp down off the sidewalk, but sometimes they step over that sidewalk onto the parking lot. And they have to be very careful because the balance can easily be lost there. And if they lose their balance, they can fall. And so that seems to be what's being described specifically there at the first part of verse 5. Anything else through that part? The almond blossoms grow white. What does that mean? Gray hair. Yeah, gray hair. I was getting my hair cut a couple of weeks ago, and Becky, the lady who cuts my hair, she shaves my beard. I get it reset every couple of weeks, and there was all these gray hairs all over the cape or whatever. And I said, "You're cutting off your own hair. I don't know where this gray hair is coming from." But I don't know why it is that you see sometimes men, their beard goes gray even before their hair does. I saw a guy at Market Street the other day who had a full gray, not even salt and pepper, full gray beard, but perfectly dark hair, just maybe graying on the edges. And it just kind of popped into my head, this idea of that gray hair comes about. And of course, Solomon does refer to gray hair as being a crown, okay, being wisdom and glory. But that idea of with age comes that graying of hair typically. Yeah, almond blossoms grow white. Anything through that? The grasshopper drags itself along. What might that be? The King James kind of has a similar, or New King James has a similar idea here, verse 5. The grasshopper is a burden. Okay, needing a cane. The idea of walking, he's addressed a little bit already in verse 5, but the idea of a lack of strength, I think certainly is part of this idea. And there's two different veins of thought on this. There are those that interpret this as being as weak as a grasshopper. There's a lot of other ways that Solomon could have used, but grasshoppers, are they real heavy? Okay, when you're young, things that are light are no problem, right? But to kind of describe the burden of old age and the burden of the weakening of their strength, even at that point when one is aged, even a grasshopper can be heavy. Even the lightest things that before were no big deal, now it's very difficult. It's very difficult to carry this or to accomplish that because the strength is no longer there. Yeah.
Up and down.
Yeah.
And then as we age, our joints hurt.
Yeah, and that was actually another one there in verse 5 regarding the grasshopper. I'm glad you mentioned that. The reference to the grasshopper is obscure, but it probably should be rendered, and the grasshopper becomes heavy. A little bit different than what the New English translation has. The New King James is slightly more accurate. Hyperbole, meaning that even something as light as a grasshopper seems too heavy to lift. Alternatively, it has been taken to refer to either bad joints, swollen ankles, a halting walk. So that's kind of the idea. In particular, this other translation, the New English translation part of this, where it describes how the grasshopper drags itself along. It's no longer able to spring forth, kind of have that spring in their step. Now they kind of have to shuffle along. And that is an alternative idea to that concept of the grasshopper. Even whether it's even a grasshopper at that point is heavy, it's a burden. Things that once were very light and very easy are difficult. Or alternatively, as Lisa mentioned, that the joints and the body no longer has that spring. It's more of a kind of a dragging along, a shuffle, because the strength isn't there. Okay, still kind of connected to the same ideas, just kind of pointing out two different variations of it. Any thoughts through that? Okay. This middle one is kind of interesting. In fact, some of your Bibles may have something very different here. And the caperberry shrivels up is the last one. King James, or New King James, this is the New English translation. The New King James says, and desire fails. And it's kind of interesting because desire no longer is stirred, paraphrases the Hebrew. I'm reading from Garrett, one of these scholars on Old Testament poetry. And the way he takes this, and of course keep in mind, for whatever reason, Garrett tends to look at things from a sexual perspective a lot of times. I'm not sure why, but a lot of this Old Testament poetry, he interprets it along that line. He says, apparently loss of sexual desire is meant. The Targum paraphrases this more directly as, you will cease from sexual practice. An alternative interpretation is that the line should be rendered, the caperberry bears fruit. Okay, and it's the difference between the two are, a lot of times we talk about how grammar, even the slightest change of certain words can change the meaning of a sentence. Well, Hebrew is doubly so. And so depending on which way the grammar kind of goes, it can kind of change that terminology. This would imply that the blossoming of the almond and fruit-bearing of the caperberry are to be taken literally, with the meaning that while nature is renewed every year, the human body simply grows older and weaker. Looking at it from the caperberry shriveling up would be a part of kind of the almond blossoms growing white, the grasshopper drags itself along. That strength is no longer there, that spring of life, that sense of energy doesn't exist anymore. But interestingly enough, and he even lists the actual Hebrew that is listed here, the caperberry bursting forth, it is destroyed, it fails. Probably the verb should be taken as the hip hill of this Hebrew word, to mean fail. Caperberries were apparently an aphrodisiac, and its failure meant the loss of sexual desire or ability. No evidence for the aphrodisiac qualities of the capers appears prior to the medieval Jewish commentaries, however, so this interpretation is not certain. So it is interesting that there is a correlation somewhat to that sexual desire, but again, I don't think that has to be the case. Okay, desire to do anything because of a lack of energy as you age, that's kind of a part of that process. Okay, once you get up in age, I mean, you would like to go about, running through the streets, but you don't have the energy anymore. And therefore, the desire, even though I'd love to, the desire fails because I can't do it anymore. It hurts too much to go around walking and running around. Again, taking Garrett, his interpretation with a grain of salt regarding a lot of the stuff he interprets as being sexual in nature, I tend to look at this more so along the lines of specifically energy. Okay, how the energy just isn't there anymore. It's shriveled up. It's just not, that desire, that energy to do things isn't there anymore. So thoughts through that? Okay. Because man goes to his eternal home, and the mourners go about in the streets. So notice how all of this happens before death. Okay. Now keep in mind, Solomon is presuming a natural death. Okay. Obviously, he's covered the concept of the fact that anything can happen. Okay. To kind of go along with his paraphrasing of the race is not always to the swift, and the battle not always to the strong. Well, long life is not always early death is not always to the aged, or however you want to phrase that. Where how sometimes death can come to even those of us who are young. But despite that, this is what Solomon is looking at this from in terms of a full natural life. This is what's going to happen if you are blessed to live that long, to encounter these changes in your body, and to recognize that at the end of it all, your Creator is God. And to me, that once you kind of come to verse 5, the end of verse 5, that idea of God being your Creator kind of rings forward here at the end of verse 5. The fact that, did God create us in this way? Did He create our bodies to do this? Yeah, He did. He created our bodies to have this process of aging. He didn't create us to live forever in the flesh. Okay? He didn't create our bodies to last and then one day we just kind of turn off or shut down. It's a process of aging. That's how God created us. And that wisdom that is involved with that, even when we're up in age, is to recognize God isn't throwing this on us as if He's mad or is malicious in nature. God created the system of nature the way He has so that when we are aged, we'll remember the fact that this is a part of life. This is just part of the way God has designed things. Anything through the end of verse 5? All right. Verse 6. So notice verse 5 and verse 6, they're not really separate. They're connected to one another. So all of these things happen, and then once all of those things have run their course, man goes to his eternal home. Mourners go about in the streets before the silver cord is removed, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the well, or the water wheel is broken at the cistern. Okay? He's describing before this takes, this is all these things that happen, verses 1 or 2 through 5, all of this is before the silver cord is removed, before the golden bowl is broken, or before the pitcher is shattered at the well, before the water wheel is broken at the cistern. What do these four represent? End of life. When you think about a golden bowl being broken, what can that golden bowl no longer do? It can't hold anything, can it? What about a pitcher being shattered at the well? What's a pitcher generally used for? To hold water. How about a water wheel broken at a cistern? Okay. It's used to pull water up, I'm assuming. Okay. Silver cord, interestingly enough, different translations have different things for the silver cord. But they're in, let's see. He sees, so an alternative interpretation sees here a silver fillet, a golden mixing bowl, both indicative of feasting and conviviality that end at death. And that's, one way to look at it. But the idea of the silver cord being removed, the way that this is explained is it's just another form of something that holds something. In fact, silver cord is actually translated in the New English as something different. Oh no, it's not. Before the silver cord is removed. Is the American Standard? What does the American Standard have there? Verse 6.
Silver cord is broken.
Silver cord is broken. Okay. Yeah. So so the New King James. Remember, you're created before the silver cord is loosed or broken, and it's the idea that you have these vessels that are designed to hold things, that are designed for a purpose. In the case of the wheel being broken at the well, it's designed for a purpose. But once it's broken, it can't fulfill that purpose anymore. And in particular, when the human body breaks at death, what is released? The soul. Right? The soul is released. That's what's being depicted by what Solomon is describing here. The golden bowl being broken, whatever's in that bowl can't stay in there anymore. The pitcher shattered at the fountain, the water's going to leak out. When the human body breaks at death, that's the ultimate breaking of the body, the spirit leaves. Okay? And that's what Solomon's describing here. Yes, sir.
What strikes me about all four of these illustrations is the suddenness.
Yeah.
And finality.
Yes.
That's the end.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great point. The finality, the suddenness in that once it's done, it's done. Okay? There may be times where we can kind of anticipate death coming. We can see it beginning to break, you could say. But once it's broken, there is no going back to mend it. Okay? Once the body gives up the spirit's gone. Okay? And the body is dead. And all of these illustrations, and of course, the New King James here adds in, remember your Creator before, which, it's just carrying it from verse 1. But the concept is that all of these events in your life, as you age, this is what's going to happen before it does. remember your Creator. Remember His wisdom. Understand that He's designed this for a reason, and make sure you're serving Him. Because once all of this happens, and ultimately, as you age, once that golden bowl is broken and the pitcher is shattered, and your life is over, there is no more opportunity to go back and fix anything or change anything or to do things differently. It's done. Anything else through verse 6? Verse 7. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. This is actually a very comforting verse, at least to me. Notice some of the specifics that Solomon mentions, how that the dust, what's the dust? The body, right? When God made Adam, what did He make Adam out of? Out of the dust of the earth, right? And so when the body dies, the body decays, it turns back into dust, and the spirit. Notice the two sides of this that Solomon specifically brings out. That the spirit or the soul within a person, where does it go? Okay, it returns to God's care. Okay, we've talked before about where do we go when we die. Of course, we recognize that place of Sheol in the Old Testament, the realm of the dead. It's referred to as Hades in the New Testament. Hades and hell are not the same thing. Hades is the realm of the dead, in which you have a place of paradise, depicted as Abraham's bosom, and then you have a place of torment. But the concept here that Solomon's bringing out, the spirit will return to God who gave it, it returns to the care of God. Okay? Now it's in God's hands. Okay? And so that spirit, it's no longer within me to do anything with. It returns to God, to His care. God places that soul in Sheol, in the realm of the dead, and depending on how we lived our life, whether we go to paradise or torment, it goes back to God who gave it. Anything through verse 7. Interestingly enough, this connection to the dust. Dust alludes to Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, and chapter 3, verse 19. This is Solomon's final consideration of Adam in the garden. The return of the Spirit to God refers to that Spirit going back to Him. All life comes from God. So that's that idea of Adame that we've talked before, that red dirt, red clay that is mentioned in Genesis. That's this concept here in verse 7 of the dust returning to the earth as it was. Anything else through verse 7? Verse 8. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. In fact, the New English translation, meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, everything is meaningless, I think is how that's rendered. And of course, vanity, we've talked before about vanity being specifically what perspective on life. All things are vanity, says the preacher. From what perspective are all things vanity? Under the sun. Okay, under the sun. He's not saying, especially with regard to remembering your Creator, verse 1, that remembering our Creator was vanity. This is taking into account everything that happens under the sun. The fact that the body decays, for instance, is itself the fact that the body simply returns to the dust as it was. That is what Solomon's considering. Vanity of vanity, says the preacher. All is vanity. Under the sun, the flesh has no meaning. What has meaning, and the only thing that will last, is the soul, and whether or not we are serving God, serving our Creator. Anything through verse 8? Okay. Verse 9. Moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yes, he pondered and sought out and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find acceptable words, and what was written was upright, words of truth. It's interesting because a lot of these scholars, they go here, verse 9 and 10 and 11, and they recognize kind of a tone shift here. that Solomon, it's as if he's not referring to himself anymore. Where before he says, I've looked into these things, but now he says, moreover, the preacher was wise. He still taught the people knowledge, as if Solomon's talking about somebody else. And that's why some commentaries you might read might refer to 2 or 3 people speaking throughout Ecclesiastes as if it wasn't just Solomon. But understand in verses 9 and 10 and in verse 11, Solomon's referring to himself in this kind of third-person mode, but he wants to do it without making it sound like he's bragging. Okay, so instead of saying, I was wise, and I taught the people, and I pondered, and I sought to find acceptance, and I. At this point, as he's concluding these things, he doesn't want to make this about him. Instead, what does he want to make it about? He wants to make it about the wisdom. Okay, rather than inserting himself here as a focus, he's putting himself kind of aside to emphasize the wisdom, okay, and the knowledge and the importance of understanding, rather than inserting himself as being a primary focus. All right, and so that's why it's important to realize that when he's referring to the preacher, he's still talking about himself. He just doesn't want to insert himself in the foreground. He wants the wisdom to be in the foreground. Moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. When it says he still taught the people knowledge, does that mean everybody listened? That everybody understood it and everybody accepted it, and so all of Israel was wise as a result? No. No, in fact, Solomon has dealt with that over the course of Ecclesiastes, mentioning how the fool will still be foolish. Most of the time, they're not going to pay attention, they're not going to listen. But he still taught the people knowledge, okay, because that was a worthy pursuit to give people the opportunity to understand. Nolan?
It's perhaps somewhat like the beginning of the book, where he differentiated his role. This is not the king commanding you have to do this, but coming from the side of that perspective of the preacher.
Right.
It's wisdom being offered. He says not everybody's going to listen. He wishes they would.
Right.
But that's how it's being set forth.
Absolutely. Yeah, all of Ecclesiastes, Solomon has never incorporated his authority as king. He's referenced the king kind of as application for how do I deal with the king, how do I deal with authorities and so forth, but he doesn't insert himself specifically to avoid that sense of authoritative command. Instead, he wants to present this as wisdom that is important for you to accept and to follow, not because I say so, but because it's wise. Yeah. Yes, he pondered and sought out and set in order many proverbs. Well, obviously we have many of those proverbs, or at least, depending on how many he wrote, maybe we only have a little bit of them. But in the book of Proverbs, most of Proverbs is written by or given to us from Solomon. And even some of this in Ecclesiastes, you could almost kind of consider some of it as proverbial, I guess you could say. The preacher, so part of that, he pondered, sought out, and set in order many proverbs. That's part of his looking into things, trying to study the nature of things. Of course, his ultimate conclusion is with regard to the study of understanding why things happen, that's God's realm. There are certain things that are distinctly God's that we can't understand. Okay, that was one thing he did observe. There are certain things we can observe and certain lessons that we should take, and of course he deals with those. The preacher sought to find acceptable words, and what was written was upright, words of truth. Acceptable words isn't acceptable from the people's side of things. He's not presenting this as if it was politically correct. Acceptable words from, first of all, the fact that it's based in truth, from God's end. These are acceptable words. These are ways of explaining things that are set forth because of observation, because of Solomon's unique insight from the wisdom that God gave him. These are ways to explain it for people to understand that is based in the truth of God. And that's what he means by acceptable words. What was written was upright, words of truth. He explained it in the best ways that he could, both the vanity of certain pursuits and as he's going to get to the one thing that isn't vain under the sun in this life that we need to make sure we hold forth. Anything through verse 10. Verse 11, the words of the wise are like goads, and the words of scholars are like well-driven nails given by one shepherd. Solomon refers to the words of the wise as being goads. And of course, that term goad, a lot of us will automatically think of Paul, on the road to Damascus. What does Jesus tell Paul? It's very hard to kick against the goads. Okay? And a goad, and Dwayne, I know, can explain it far better than I can, but a goad is meant to take livestock and send it a certain way. And when it's trying to veer off or go do something else, no, you goad it back along the path it's supposed to go. And it's meant to help correct, to instruct, to establish a pattern of behavior of what's expected. Okay, and this idea of goads, the words of the wise are like goads, not the idea of forcibly commanding, but rather the idea, just like with Paul, the things that Paul had heard, the things that Paul had seen, the conviction of the people of faith, all this kind of led up to meeting Jesus on the road to Damascus. And all of this kind of just clicking. It's hard for you to kick against the goads. Everything's kind of been steering you a certain way. Now it needs to come into clarity for you. And that's what the words of the wise do. They are meant to stick with you. They're meant to help guide you along your path. And so that when you do come across a situation where your natural instinct may be to go to the right, but those words of the wise are in the back of your head screaming at you, you really need to go left. Don't turn right here, go left. And that's what is meant there as a sense of direction. And then the words of scholars are like well-driven nails. This idea of specifically the words of scholars being specifically knowledge. Okay, the words of the wise is understanding and the wisdom that is associated with knowledge. But scholars speaks to specifically information, facts about God, facts about the history of how God has dealt with His people, facts about what is expected of you. These are well-driven nails. What happens when nails aren't well-driven? If you're building a shed, okay, and you're putting these 2x4s together, and these nails are kind of sticking out the sides and all this other stuff, what's going to happen perhaps when a storm comes along? It's going to fall over, okay? I would say something about my dad and experience with a shed that he tried to build once. I won't, because I know he watches the YouTube channel, so I won't embarrass him. But I have seen sheds built with not well-driven nails, okay? And so sometimes you have that situation where the words of scholars, these facts, this information that is specific, it's meant to ground you. Well-driven nails, they provide structure. They provide support and strength. And that's what Solomon's referring to, given by one shepherd. The words of the wise and the words of scholars, facts, information, and its understanding and wisdom is given by one shepherd. In this context, who's the one shepherd? Of course, in 1 Peter chapter 5, the chief shepherd is whom? Christ. In this context, the one shepherd would be whom? God. Okay, God. And of course, to an extent, Christ certainly, but given Old Testament here, we're talking about God specifically. Anything through verse 11. Verse 12. And further, my son, be admonished by these, of making many books there is no end, and much study is wearisome to the flesh. Now, hold on a minute. He says that the words of wise and the words of scholars, these are good things. And he even says, my son, be admonished by these. And I tend to associate that, I really feel like that should be attached to verse 11, just because that admonishment, you need to listen to these individuals, those who are wise, those who have the information primarily about God, certainly. But then he says, of many books there is no end. It's as if he's saying, don't bother studying. Much studying is wearisome to the flesh. Don't spend all your time reading books. How can you have one without the other? How can I have the words of the wise and the words of scholars without reading it? Yes, Nolan?
One of the senses is that God's Word is sufficient. It has everything that we need. Going back to the reference to the goads, as he's speaking particularly to younger people, we're thinking this time, those words of wisdom, you said, will prod you, put you back on the path, but only if you open up the Word, listen to it, and let it prod you or guide you direction. And now in verse 12, you have to go, well, maybe there's something else beyond this.
There you go. Yep.
Find the library, 1,000 books or 100 others.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You know, when you consider all of the commentaries available to us, let's keep this in the realm of religion, okay? You think about all the commentaries that are available to us, and you think about all of the words that are out there written by all kinds of people from all different denominations and faiths. You read one thing and you say, oh, like for instance, Garrett, he says he thinks that this is what that means. And then you read another, oh, this person has a completely different idea. In fact, there's some texts, no matter what commentary you pick up, you'll find a differing idea. Okay, it can be confusing to the point that it's almost like, well, how can I even know the truth then? Well, what do we go back to? What is our basis? Never mind what other people think. What's our foundation? The Scriptures. God's Word is the foundation. And that's why anytime you're looking to study a text or you're having trouble with a passage, make sure you read it first. Don't go to a commentary first. Don't go to the writings of somebody else first. Read it, take it in, dwell on it, consider the context of it, formulate an idea of what you think that means. Then, if you want to get other perspectives, then you can look at different commentaries. But don't just put all of your faith in these men who aren't inspired of God. Okay? Some of these men are very knowledgeable, and the things that they write seem to be very accurate in a lot of things. But I've never once found a commentator who seems to be accurate on everything. Not even those members of the church. There's always something that I found that I'm like, I don't necessarily think that's what's being said there. And so it's important to make sure we go back to what God says. Ben.
I think that's part of verse 11. It's talking about the one shepherd.
Yeah.
The one source of the need. And then, you go back to the beginning of Ecclesiastes, and it's all saying, I tried all this, I tried this, I tried that. Now he's saying all that. I've already done that.
Yeah. And you don't need to waste your time with it.
Waste your time with all these other books and study. This is our own source. This is what
Yeah. Yeah, I thought the NET here, I kind of like this translation. It takes that first part of verse 12 and connects it to verse 12 rather than my thought process of verse 11. But the way the NET reads, be warned, my son, of anything in addition to them. There is no end to the making of many books, and much study is exhausting to the body. And so that kind of bridges that link between verse 11 and verse 12, recognizing, listen, if you go beyond the one shepherd, take it with a grain of salt, okay? Don't put all your stock in reading what other men say, because men are fallible. God is not. All right. Well, we will finish. Verses 13 and 14, we'll finish up next Sunday with Ecclesiastes. Go ahead and get the notes on the back table with the introduction notes as well as the chapter 1 notes. There are questions on the back of chapter 1, and we'll get into 1 Peter, Lord willing, next week. Thank you, everybody.